Josh is a community strategist, open source advocate, web developer, and dusty foot philosopher. You'll have to ask him about that one. He travels frequently promoting free and open source software, inclusive community building, and teaching aspiring and junior developers how to learn by contributing to open source. Previously, he was a community manager at O'Reilly and an open source program manager at Google, and we're super lucky to have him here at Salesforce now as a strategist. And I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Thank you, Josh.
Again, my name is Josh. Sometimes I describe myself as a short stack web developer, and I'm an open source advocate. So currently I'm at Salesforce Open Source, and I serve as the vice president of the open source initiative, so I may feel a little strongly about intellectual property, and if you also feel strongly about it, ask me questions. If you don't, beware. So I want to talk to you today about open source citizenship. So the free software movement began in '83, and at the time it was legitimately radical. In '98, the term open source was coined as a way to encourage the adoption of free software by businesses. So open source includes free software licenses as well as more permissive licenses. Now, today, free, libre, and open source software, or FLOSS, is literally everywhere. To say nothing of the way this approach to intellectual property and collaboration is shaking up other fields. Now, in 2019, it's an inextricable part of global infrastructure, and it has massively accelerated innovation and developer productivity. Now, as we discover the many benefits of embracing open source software, we also begin to understand that companies' compliance efforts are just table stakes. It's not enough just to be a user of open source software and be compliant with the licenses. This is when it dawns at us that the health of the projects we rely on is an existential concern for us. Ditto our relationships with those projects. So healthy projects, they offer regular releases, reliable security response, and new development for more people than any one of us could ever hire. Unhealthy projects, well, that's a risk. That's why we collectively, as many companies in the industry, are investing in the health of open source communities, which is great and necessary, and we definitely need more of it. But health is hard to define. It's hard to measure, and getting easier thanks to projects like Chaos Community Metrics. And while a lot has been made of the struggle for open source projects to get the financial support they need, we can't just throw money at the problem. Frankly, money makes things worse sometimes. A healthy project has the financial support it needs, as well as the governance model and culture to put those resources to good use. So, open source citizenship. What am I actually trying to get at here? I've been talking to leaders from corporate open source programs offices, from open source communities, and from nonprofit foundations. So I'm here to talk about what companies are doing currently to support open source projects, what forms of support those projects are actually asking for, and then also how we can foster a culture of open source citizenship within the companies that we belong to. And then further, no, I'll leave it at that because we only have so much time. So first, what are companies actually doing today to support open source projects in the communities that surround them? Okay, upstream contributions. Ideally, most of us, when we're using an open source project, we're not creating an internal fork of it, but we're using the main master branch and we're staying up to date. And when we make a fix or a new feature, we upstream that for the project so that everybody can benefit from it. That's, basic. Sometimes companies are paying staff members to contribute. I know there are a number of companies that have full-time employees who are working also full-time on open source projects. Of course, companies can sponsor events, projects, foundations. That's all well and good. Sometimes there's the donation of resources beyond financial. So, for instance, providing event space to the local meetup community, or for the summit of maintainers for any given project. any kinds of in-kind resources like that are super valuable. Companies are also sponsoring and becoming members in the foundations and standards bodies. So that means, there's usually a financial relationship there as well. But on top of that, their companies are at the table trying to help move the standard or the project forward. Standards bodies, just talked about that. And then programs to help new contributors get started. So we're not seeing a whole lot of this from companies, but there's one giant example, and that would be Google with Google Summer of Code. That has been modeled by Rails Girls Summer of Code and Outreachy. And all of these are fantastic programs that teach people how to get into, how to be software developers by having them contribute to open source and get paid to do so. And that's a fantastic way for companies to support open source communities because, frankly, a lot of communities don't really think about succession a whole lot. They don't necessarily think about recruiting new members proactively, but that's a critical part of a project that we want to stick around for, for the future. So these are the array of things that, in talking to people, I know these are things that companies are already doing to support open source communities. So if there's something on there that your company isn't doing already, I encourage you to say, hey, whether this is your marketing department or your company has an OSPO or whoever has the sway to do these things within your company, I encourage you to go to them and say, hey, look at what these other companies are doing to support open source communities, recognizing that we, or you, also have an existential dependence on these projects being healthy. You should be doing these as well. Now, as I've been giving this talk over time, I've been adding to this list because it's an ongoing research project. So if there's something I'm missing here, I hope you'll grab me in the break and let me know. So it's one thing to look at what companies are doing, but what are people actually asking for? What kinds of support are the communities asking for? For starters, volunteer all of the things. And so critically, I've not listed code or development on here because obviously these projects need code, but I don't think it's controversial to say that by and large, the user experience, the documentation, the design of open source projects generally sucks, right? It's made by developers, usually for developers, and developers have expectation of what other developers have between their ears. And so we don't necessarily design these things or document these things in such a way that they're usable by people who aren't like us. And if, like me, you have any stake in that the software freedom movement, where the goal is to give people more freedom by making sure that the software they're using is open and accountable to them, if we're failing on these parts, then we're failing user freedom. So we really need to work on elevating these as a priority within our projects. And if companies can donate their time, their employees' time to do these things, then all the better. And I know one of the projects that we're going to be trying to work on at Salesforce has the concept of VTO, volunteer time off. And if we can encourage employees to use that volunteer time off to contribute these non-code things to the projects, then everybody will win. So largely, when companies are engaging with open source projects, they're engaging very specifically around things that they need. Our company needs this to scale beyond 10,000 cores. Our company needs this to be X, Y, or Z. Whatever it is, the reason the company showed up in the first place is because they needed it. But there's more. What we need to get in the habit of doing is going above and beyond our own narrow self-interest when we engage with these projects. So it's one thing for me to come to a project and say, let me help you build out this feature that I need. Generally they'll accept that. They'll be grateful for the help. But what about all the things that I'm not interested in doing, but still need to be done? I should help them with triaging issues in pull requests. I should help them with their mentorship programs or whatever the case may be. for companies to really build goodwill in an open source community, they need to go beyond what their narrow needs are. And then maybe the community will be more responsive to the company when they have a specific feature request or something like that. But we need to get beyond our self-interest. Now this one is one that actually struck me as surprising. I hadn't thought about this before someone mentioned it to me. But open source projects live and die by the community that forms around them. And for a community to be healthy and for the project to be healthy and reliable, for us to know that we can put this in our dependency chain and not worry about it 10 years down the line, we need to know that that community is healthy, that there's a regular influx of new contributors, so that basically the project's well maintained. And so one thing that we don't see enough of, reported from the open source communities I spoke to, is the placement of senior employees, say people with architecture experience or higher level technical decision-making experience, placement of those individuals within the community. Because it's one thing for there to be mentors in the community helping junior developers become developers, but it's another thing to help those people move up even further up the chain so that the project has someone who's perhaps architecturally minded who can be a potential maintainer of the project in the future. This is another thing that I've heard communities ask for. Funding for contributors and maintainers of projects to go to conferences or events or summits, because while open source and free software is very much about like remote distributed development, there's still nothing like getting together in person. I mean, that's why we're here today. And so a lot of the people who contribute to these projects don't necessarily have an employer who will fund their travel to it. Less and less people are contributing to open source as a hobby, though those people still exist, and thank goodness they do. Most people are contributing as part of their job, but not everybody has that privilege. Not everybody has an employer who will send them to the event. And so if we as companies can donate to these projects to help fund contributors' travel, whether or not they work for us, that will ultimately result in a healthier, better project for us to rely on. I mean, at minimum, we should fund our own employees' travel to these events. Event space. I mentioned that earlier. That's something that companies are providing. It's something that I hear there's a greater need for that than there is a supply. So the more people can open up their own companies and event spaces or just underwrite renting out an event space for a project, the better. Testing and QA resources. Now this is one that also struck me as a surprise. I think this comes down to compute power, basically. Projects want to, if they've got like a continuous integrate, a CI/CD thing set up where you push and it automatically runs all these tests, those tests have to run on something, and that's not free. And so the more that we can either provide financial resources so that they can pay for their server time, for their compute power, or just donate, if say I'm someone who's at Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. We have clouds, let people use them. And maybe I'm not one of the major cloud companies. Maybe I have other capacities that I can share. I've had people point out, for instance, if you have like basic hardware equipment, for all the open source projects that have a hardware component to them, well, they need somewhere that they can do their testing, where they can do their fabrication and all of those things. And so if you're a company with any of those capabilities, please share. This one was not a surprise to me. I don't know about everyone else here, but my employment contract says that basically everything I create while I'm employed is owned by my employer, or at least I have the right of first refusal for everything I do. Yeah. That's not cool. And I understand that, if I'm writing code or documentation for something that is specifically a work product or project, yeah, fine. Copyright my employer, that's all right. But if I'm contributing to open source, I shouldn't have to worry about copyright assignment here. I shouldn't have to worry that, oh, I need to jump through these extra hoops just to make sure that I can be like a decent citizen and give back to this project. Like, the contracts, the employment contracts, raise the bar and make it more difficult than it needs to be to contribute to open source, and that's a problem. Software Freedom Conservancy is a foundation that's working on this through a project that they haven't really rolled out. They joke that it's their own vaporware, but it's a project called Contract Patch. And the idea is helping people understand that the contracts we have as employees don't need to be the way that they are. And in fact, when we are interviewing with a company and we've been offered a job, that is the single most powerful moment. That is the moment when we will never have as much power or leverage in the negotiation with the company than when they've already invested the time to interview us, have given us an offer, and we say, I was expecting this for salary, or I was expecting this in my contract. There's include this in your negotiations. And also, for those of us in companies, if we have any sway on how we hire and recruit, this is something that we should flag as something that will be attractive to potential candidates. I could go on here, but I shouldn't. And then just jobs for maintainers and contributors. So if we are, as a company, particularly reliant on this one project, I can think of like YouTube is particularly reliant on FFmpeg for obvious reasons. If you're using a project and it's so core to your business, then hire those maintainers. And don't just hire them and make them disappear into your org and make them work on your own software, but let them keep working on that project, because you're getting way more value out of it than even that one person's salary, even if they're very senior. So hiring people from the community is yet another thing that communities are asking for. And then also, encourage universities to give credit to people who do contribute to free and open source software. So when we have internship programs, or when we have, or when we are just participating in an open source project ourselves, we should encourage the junior developers that are coming along to seek course credit for their participation. But then we should also offer them the, sometimes it's called the curricular practical training letter. It differs depending on where you are. Just offer proof that, yes, this person did this stuff, that was valuable, they deserve credit for it. That will incentivize more people to get involved with free and open source software earlier in their careers, and the earlier that we can get people involved, the better for all of us. Okay. All right. It's a lot. Again, this is an ongoing research project, so surely there are things that I'm missing. Please let me know. I'm going to leave this slide up for a second because the list slides are always great for people to capture. So having looked at what companies are currently doing, what communities are asking for, let's wrap up with just the big picture of what it takes to cultivate a culture of open source citizenship within companies. This could be the subject of a whole series of talks, and this is admittedly also a less developed area of my research, but it boils down to a few things. Enumerate and value your dependencies. What projects, do you even know what open source projects are in use at your company? If not, holy crap, why not? If so, great, how do you value them? What is it worth to you as a company to be able to, how much time have you saved in having to not build that project from the ground up? How much time do you save because it's being maintained by people other than yourself? Value that. Put a figure on it, because it makes it that much easier to justify open source engagement. And then incentivize contribution. okay, great. I'm working, I'm working on a feature or product, service, whatever. I'm working in 2-week sprints. Why would I, with all the things that are on my backlog, why would I put upstreaming to open source in that backlog without being incentivized to do that, right? So we need to make sure that everyone from the people in the trenches who are actually contributing to these projects and building products and services, to the managers or the people who are the scrum masters who are leading those teams, all the way up through leadership, understands that we need to incentivize open source contribution, otherwise it won't happen. For as much lip service as we can give to how we value open source and how we want to support it, if we're not actually incentivizing people to contribute to it in their jobs, then it's just not going to happen, and it's just so many words. Raise awareness. People have to know that they can open source things in the first place, or they can use open source in the first place, or they can upstream in the first place. And even companies that have been using open source for a long time and have really dialed in their processes for inbound and outbound open source still have a challenge with awareness. And what that comes down to is giving tech talks or internal emails or postings or training, and more training. So this is really what it comes down to. For a lot of people, contributing to open source projects just doesn't feel natural to them. It's new to them. So I was a web developer for about 10 years before I made my first contribution to an open source project. I had been building, I was operating a small web agency, building Drupal sites for small and medium-sized businesses. And it never really dawned on me that I was, like, why the software I was using was free. I didn't stop to think, like, well, it's kind of awesome that I've got all these Legos I can put together and turn into something that makes me money. I only came around to realizing there's something special going on here with free and open source software later on. And part of it is not just stopping to realize what these projects are and why we get to use them and where they come from. Part of it is understanding how to contribute to them. And developing in the open can be terrifying. Like, I don't know about y'all, but when I first thought about contributing back to, in my case it was Drupal, I had to read their code style guide. I had to go down a massive checklist of things that my code needs to satisfy these requirements to be acceptable. But I was frankly scared. Like, most of my code, I had been freelancing or working on small teams. The only people who saw my code were people who I knew wouldn't laugh at me anyway. And so taking that next step to, like, develop truly in the open and not know how people are going to respond to it was kind of terrifying. So if there's any way that we can, within our companies, hold hack days or something structured to give people a hand, it doesn't matter how senior they are within the organization. If they've never contributed to open source, this might still be scary. So the more that we can give people hands-on experience, the better. Okay. Again, it's an ongoing project. Please let me know if I've missed anything. Please let me know if you have any questions. My hope is that all of us within the various companies that we work in today and tomorrow, we can help move the needle to making our companies be better open source citizens so that we're not giving back just the bare minimum. We're not just compliant with the licenses, but that we're actually authentically giving. And it doesn't have to be altruistic. The business case there is for all of this. Minimizing risk is probably something that many people within your company will understand if they don't understand why we should do this out of the goodness of our hearts. So please, let's all make our companies better open source citizens. Thank you.
First, I want to thank you, Josh. That was a great talk. And I also wanted to do a shout out to the Salesforce open source team. Josh, thank you. And Chris Kelly, who's here somewhere, who oversees our open source stuff as well. They've sponsored this conference, and they've been an immense help to us as oclif, as an open source project that's part of Salesforce. We have these open source experts, and they provide us with great guidance. They also connected us to Google Summer of Code, which Josh mentioned. So we have a student who's going to be working on an oclif project this summer as part of that. And you can ask Jeff or Felipe for more of those details.